to GONKCAST, an Autechre podcast. I'm Gabe.
I'm Dan.
And this is another bonus episode about your emails. We set a personal record for listener emails this week, and while we crammed as many as we possibly could into our Confield and Gantz graph episode, we had to save more than a few for this bonus episode, and we got a bunch more about records we've covered in the past. We're going to tackle most of those today, but we still won't be able to get to all of them. I want to stress, though, that we really love reading all of your crazy interpretations. Frankly, some of them are really crazy, but I still love them. And your memories of getting into various albums for the first time, all that stuff, even when we don't have time to read them on the show. I don't know about Dan, but I read every single one, and if I haven't responded yet, I will soon. I'm a little bit behind in responses, to be honest, but I am reading. On that note, our next episode is on Draft 730. We've heard from a lot of you already, but there's still time to send us your thoughts. GONKCASTpod@gmail.com. As always, you'll find that email address in the show notes. Okay, we always like to pair our listener email episodes with an Autechre release that's not quite essential, and this week we've decided to turn the clock back to 1996 and discuss the 12-inch single We Are R.Y. R.Y. Are We. That like scrambles my brain every time I try to read it. So Dan, what background info do we need to know?
Yeah, so Autechre released We Are R.Y. on April 14th, 1996, a quiet year for the duo. Aside from a handful of remixes for other artists, the 12-inch single could only be purchased via mail order or at some shows on the 1996 tour, and it's never been repressed. The release doesn't specify an RPM, and Sean said it was, quote, our intention to not write it on the record, but Warp's 1996 advertisement includes track links that confirm it should be played at 45 RPM. If you need even more mystery, it's not entirely clear what this release is actually titled. Warp calls it We Are R.Y., the Warp 20 box set calls it Untitled, and the record sleeve writes We Are R.Y., R.Y. Are We, as if the two tracks make up one long album title.
I'll hit you with one last bit of trivia. Sean has said that We Are R.Y. were the first two tracks we did on the Yamaha RY30 drum machine, and that both tracks are entirely done in the RY30. With a bit of FX on the different channels, maybe, can't remember. In regard to reception, this super rare single mostly flies under the radar. It's got a measly 3.10 on Rate Your Music, but I don't think that tells the whole story, as most people who have actually heard it seem to like it a lot. We actually just got an email from Steve who writes, this was only available via mail order. I convinced my dad to order it for me, and I remember him telling me how he really didn't like having to leave his credit card on an answering machine in England. It arrived with a couple Black-type artwork slip discs. I really enjoy this record. It was great to listen to it again recently after being without a turntable for years. So Dan, what did you think of We Are R.Y.?
You know, I like it. You know, it's maybe not the most essential Autechre release, but it's kind of dancey in a fun way. I know we sometimes complain when they get a little techno-y, but I really enjoyed the danciness in this one, I think.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you actually, because it's kind of a rollicking good time. It's like pure just electro propulsion. And again, that might be because we're listening to it at 45 RPM. It seems like you ought to listen to it at 45 RPM, but it's probably a little bit more ambery at 33. But anyway, it's just got this nice electro, propulsion, like I said. Mm-hmm. It's got some of that hissing and, static bursts from the tri-rep era, but I wondered what you thought about it being kind of rolled into a pretty accessible package. They're obviously using this drum machine and, it's got kind of that old school classic sound of some of the Roland drum machines. You know what I mean? That kind of beeping is almost something like the little cowbell on the 808 or something like that. Yeah. You know what I mean? I wondered if you hated that since you really didn't like hearing recognizable normal sounds when we talked about Incunabula.
I did complain about that, and I normally do feel that way, but I think here, it's a 12-inch release. It's never been reissued. I mean, it's decidedly obscure, It's not on an album. I think it's okay, it's sort of like I really like the Lego Feet 12-inch and stuff, because out of the context of a record and stuff, it's this just sort of feels like fun. It sort of feels like the Autechre guys maybe letting loose a little bit, and like you said, it's kind of just an experiment with this drum machine, which I realized once you read it out loud, RY30. I guess maybe that's where the title sort of.
That didn't even dawn on me for some reason.
Yeah, it didn't until like literally 30 seconds ago for me. But it just like sort of it sounds like experimentation with like this machine. And while like you get some of these more recognizable sounds and everything, I think they still like change them enough that it doesn't sound like the demo song of this drum machine or something. I think it's much more like, I don't want to say forgivable, because I didn't like absolutely hate that the songs on Incunabula or anything. It just irked me a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, there are points where, it's pretty inspiring. Like on the second track, RY Are We, there's this kind of, it's sort of like alternating with the kick almost. Like this kind of low, I don't know how to describe it, like a low clip, like a kind of glitch type sound. Mm-hmm. It's just got a lot of like low end on it. It just seems like they took a bass drum sound on this drum machine and like, just clipped it so close that it's just like, sounds like it's fucking up. You know what I mean? And any normal person would be like, oh, you accidentally, you messed that sound up. But they were like, no, this is awesome. And it gets into almost like pan-sonic territory. But I don't want to overstate things, because there are just little touches like that where you can sense that they're pushing this drum machine into places it was like never meant to go, which I love. But for the most part, I mean, it's pretty straightforward. It's pretty open. It's like, not sound design is not front and center here. But we've talked about, I think, a little bit how the guys will say that they like to get a piece of equipment and try to learn it inside and out by making like entire pieces with just one piece of equipment. So like it might be just a bass synthesizer, and they're going to try to make an entire track out of it just so they know every little nook and cranny of this thing, And it just seems like maybe this is one rare case where they thought it was cool enough to release.
Yeah, I was thinking about that, because we had mentioned that before on the show and stuff, and it really does sort of feel like that. I mean, you sent me a video of like a guy demonstrating that drum machine, and I watched it, and like I did sort of like recognize some of the sounds from that video and the track, but yeah, I think they just found happened to create something that was cool enough, and I think it's definitely cool enough for 12-inch. I mean, honestly, I would like to hear some of these other things with them learning machines. I think that would be like a cool sort of. I mean, when you're releasing a 7-inch that is only mail order, and I found like the advertisement that you ordered it from. Right. It wasn't like simple, if you were buying that, you were definitely a fan of, you didn't just stumble upon it. This wasn't going to be your first, listen to Autechre or anything,
Yeah. And, it's just like neat listening to the songs because, they sound inessential, but also fun in the sense that they are like little showcases of different sequences and stuff, mm-hmm. Like the first track, We Are Our Why, is like 8 minutes, something long. And it just kind of moves through different patterns. It doesn't like build to anything. It doesn't feel like, it arrives at this logical conclusion, even though it does get like a little warmer and I don't know, pretty in like an Aphex sense toward the end. But it just sort of moves between different ideas, it feels like, and it's fun how it flows right together. And RY Are We works almost the same way on a smaller scale, where it's like got a slightly like mysterious, spidery quality to it, and then sort of shifts into something like much prettier and warmer, more in the major scale, melodic, almost like Boards of Canada territory a little bit. But you get what I mean? Just like as like little showcases of just like all that they can do with this thing.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about it before, and people say it frequently that Autechre is like sort of like the electronic jam band, and
right.
Like this is sort of what it feels like. Because you're right, it's. I don't want to use the term noodly because that's like negative connotation, but it's a little like noodly, experiencing this drum machine and taking it down on these paths, because you're right, it's really just like a going through all these sequences, not to say that it sounds like random or not put together. I mean, I think it flows very nice, but you're right, it's not like building to a logical conclusion or anything like it really doesn't seem like anything more than just simply kind of having fun.
Yeah, and it kind of works here, honestly. I mean, I think if you know, I think the second track is not nearly as good as the first track, but you know, if that first track, you know, came on in like a dance club environment, like I would lose my shit. It's just like an absolutely fun good time. I particularly like when like the bass is just like pummeling you, and there's kind of like these really hard clipped, you know, like hi-hat type sounds, kind of like in the tri-repete sense of like they're so you know, hard cut, and it kind of like boggles your mind a little bit while that part is going on. I really like that. But this is a good way to transition into, do you see this as like existing between tri-repete and chiastic slide at all? Like some kind of, you can see them moving from one to the next, because, you know, you mentioned the jammy quality here, and it does feel to me like chiastic slide is trying to do a little bit more of that jamming, you know, as opposed to like kind of the continuous minimalist loops of tri-repete or something. It has probably a lot more of a tri-repete sound, and yet it's not as like sound bending. You know, do you see it as any kind of like, you know, missing piece in Autechre's development, or more of just like, this is a little one-off?
If you want to like read into it, you know, I think like what you just said is sort of right. You know, it does definitely like have more of the like kind of sound of tri-repete, but the jamminess of chiastic, but then, you know, not the looping and everything. I think more it's a one-off than anything else. But, you know, I could see why, you know, someone would want to read into it that way. But I think that's more of you know, put people foisting that onto the record. Yeah,
it feels kind of like a thing that they could have done in an afternoon. Like, just, it was...
Yeah, and not in a bad way. Like,
yeah, not in a bad way.
In a fun way.
It's fun and breezy, but it's just like, it was probably raining or something, and they were like, you want to mess with this new drum machine that I found or whatever, you know? So, and does it deserve greater attention? To me, it's just kind of like, it's nice that it's a little buried treasure.
Yeah, I think it's nice that it's a little buried treasure. You know, like I said, I think these like little, you know, jams or fun thing, like I think it works much better as being like something that's clearly just for the dedicated fan or whatever. You know, it's nothing that's gonna like blow your mind. If you weren't already an Autechre fan, this isn't gonna make you one or break you from being one. So I think it's like kind of, I mean, it'd be nice if, like, you know, since it came out in 1996 and hasn't been reissued or anything, you know, it'd be nice if it was like accessible in a way, like where you could find it a little easier.
Yeah, like
you know, like
a
reissue, a streaming. You know, if it had made it to the EPs, you know, box set or something, like that would be nice. But you know, I don't think it should be like, oh man, you gotta hear, you know, We Are RY or whatever. You know.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because it's got such a like nice warm sound, and probably a lot of that is because you can only listen to vinyl rips of this. And it's so funny because just out of like pure curiosity, I downloaded a vinyl rip of Confield because I was like, what the hell would that even sound like? And it does sound like really like warm and, you know, just, I don't know, like a little bit crunchier, and just it like totally antithetical, I think, to the Confield sound, but it was like kind of cool to hear. Okay, let's move on to the emails. You want to take the first one, Dan?
Yeah, let's stick with Steve for a minute, who writes, a common criticism I hear on your podcast are vocal samples, such on Lost or Bass Cadet, or if the track is more keen to techno, such as a Second Bad Vibe. It makes me wonder if you guys aren't a fan of a lot of electronic music, or if both of you just don't like it when Autechre dabbles in the more traditional techno compositions.
I think I just kind of object to this premise. I don't think any of those songs are like techno to me. You know, you can hear like maybe elements of techno in Autechre sometimes. I love techno. I just don't think vocal samples like equal techno in any way at all. I especially don't see Second Bad Vibe as any kind of like techno related thing. It's got kind of like a jungle breakbeat thing. But to me, the larger point is just like, of course we love electronic music, but I just don't necessarily like when Autechre feels like it's so obvious, you know, that they're like making a jungle track or something like that. You know, like it's not everybody, but it's just Autechre. I expect to like sort of have my mind blown or something. And when they just sound like sort of fitting neatly into the boxes of some particular genre, I feel a little let down somehow.
Yeah, I basically exactly agree with you. You know, when I listen to Autechre, I want I want like the boundaries pushed. I don't, if I want to listen to a jungle track, I'll listen to a jungle artist, kind of thing. Like it's just, I like my Autechre, boundary breaking.
Yeah. And it's interesting about the vocal samples too, because like there's something about hearing vocal samples that like often takes me out of it when I'm listening to Autechre. It just reminds me like that's a thing in the real world. I know how they made that. I know that it's a sample. Like it just kind of like the pure just rush of like all these insane sounds, like this entire sound world I've never heard. It just gets like the bubble gets popped when I hear something like recognizable from the earth. And there are times where they like totally twist a vocal sample, like on, I think like Lentic Catacresis, for example, where it's like, or they're I think it was on Dale on Tri Repete. You know what I mean? It's like totally alienized.
Yeah, I think there was one on Confield that I mentioned as really liking and stuff, or maybe it was Chiastic. I can't remember, but I just sort of, to be honest, I don't like vocal samples on like any electronic music. It's just it's sort of one of those. I mean, with Autechre, I agree with you. It's one of those things that like takes you out of that world, and they just always. Or most of the time, just kind of become corny to me. It's just something I don't really enjoy.
Yeah, I guess I don't agree in general about electronic music and vocal samples, but with Autechre for sure. I want to read a little bit more from Steve, a correction he sent us. He said, I was shocked to hear you be somewhat dismissive of Scam Records and gloss over them and mispronounce it Scram. Whoops, sorry. When Scam Records is key to telling Autechre's story. The 1997 Scampler album featuring Lego Feet, Jega, Boards of Canada, Gescom, Bola, and Freeform is still one of my favorite albums of all time. The ultra limited and anonymous at the time Mask Records created a lot of hype in the IDM scene in the late 90s. Gescom and Autechre are featured on 2 of those records. I don't think we have to discuss this, but I just wanted to read it because it does sound important. I didn't mean to, dismiss Scam Records. I haven't actually listened yet, but I did download that Scampler album straight away when I read this, and maybe we'll use it for, a future listener email episode. I also want to credit Steve for recommending the Black 2 mixtape, which I also downloaded, and I'm really enjoying. It's like kind of cool to hear a couple Autechre tracks like in a party vibe and how well that actually works. But you want to move on to the next email, Dan?
Yeah, from listener Joe. He says, I was pretty shocked to discover that there are anti-Drain 2 people out there. To me, that's the first really great Autechre ending track. Nuane, Radio, and Tear Tear are all good songs, but none of them really have an album ending feel to me. They all do the same trick where they start out feeling like any other track on the album, and then towards the end start breaking down the various effects or tempo changes to suddenly feel like something is ending. Drain 2, on the other hand, feels like it was composed as a massively epic end to something from the very beginning. I was very blown away by how you guys didn't like the sound design. The interlocking melodies, harmonies, and rhythms work perfectly to create a frantic, emotional, anxious effect that feels sad, beautiful, and like something truly great is being lost or ending. I'm probably just a huge sentimental sucker, but I love those kind of emotional pieces to end albums, such with Our Cats, All End, Lentic, whatever, V-letter mix, etc., rather than simply interesting or impressive songs like Radio, Sublimit, Oneium, or YJYUX. Thanks for all those song titles.
Yeah, I was looking forward to when I copied this in. Looking forward to
I like you gave that one to me. Yeah.
It's an interesting point. I guess I want to make 2 points sort of against that, which is that yes, I agree that Drain 2, it just feels like it's entirely an ending. It's all end, if you will. And it's like, it feels massive in that way and like a grand closure, just like Joe describes. But I don't think LP5 really, deserves such an ending, just personally. It's like, you know what I mean? It's not like I think of like Pier, right? Which is just such an incredible closer to EP7. And it wouldn't be half the track it is if it didn't come at the end of EP7, because EP7 has been like so abrasive and just so, gritty and distorted and glitchy that when all of a sudden it like opens up in this like kind of clean, emotionally available space, it's like really impactful. LP5 is emotionally open all the time, like every other track, so it doesn't hit as hard, and it feels like, he says it kind of dismissively, but I like some of those earlier closing tracks, how it's like, sounds like, yeah, this is going to be like a normal track. And then it just like falls apart or disintegrates or something like that. This is like already disintegrated. And I just don't feel like the album built to that level yet.
Yeah, I think you put it pretty well. I don't really have anything to add, honestly.
It is interesting though. Like sometimes they have these closers that are like big epic statements in themselves. And sometimes they are kind of like little codas to the album. I do kind of like how they alternate between that. While we're on the topic of LP5, I want to read this email from listener Darren. He says, hey, nice episode on LP5 and EP7. Another fun listen. I agree with you about Autechre playing with formats around this time. LP5 definitely feels at home on CD as the sound of the album is so clinical, laser focused, and crystalline, so it just suits the digital medium. They also released the mini disc album as Guestcom that same year, which was another obvious play on format, that time taking advantage of the mini disc shuffle feature. Again, we don't have to talk about this, but I just wanted to read it because it's proof that I was right, I think. I didn't even think of this, but you know what I mean? I'm right. They were really thinking about the medium in the 90s a lot, and probably even on into now, like thinking about the digital medium with LSEC and stuff like that. So you don't even have to respond. I'm just not in agreement. I'm right about everything I say.
All right.
So let me move on to the next email. I want to shout out listeners Phil, Darren, and Jeff for sending us the extended UVL. Awesome. Love it. I just want to live in that track forever. And here's another Confield comment from listener Cameron. After Confield, each AE release pushed further and further past traditional boundaries. I mean, don't get me wrong, it can be a challenging listen, but it's rewarding, and especially compared to some later material, unlocks its secrets pretty readily with a few listens. Bind is probably their most caustic work up to this point, but it's followed by Eidetic Cason, which is almost a club banger by comparison. There are certainly some harder to understand tracks, but there's quite a bit easily listenable material too. In the context of 2020, I think Confield might be the best AE entry point. That's a hot take. What do you think about Confield as the best entry point?
Yeah, that is a bit of a hot take, but I think like what he's saying, you know, in the context of 2020, I think he's got a good point. If you say like, you know, someone wants to get into, you know, today's Autechre, I think it's hard to convince someone to get, you know, to listen to LSEC or NTS, you know, just because of the, you know, the breadth of them, you know, how large they are. But you know, if someone is interested, you know, Confield is sort of like a, you know, the easier step into that. You know, it's a reasonable length. I think he's right there. You know, there's some things in it that are, you know, quote unquote easy listening, and I think there are as well on LSEC and NTS. But again, you know, those records are just so massive that I think he's got a decent point with it being in the context of 2020. Outside of that, I don't think Confield is the best entry point.
Yeah, I'm kind of conflicted because I feel like some people, and honestly myself included, if I didn't already know Autechre, I'm the kind of person that likes to jump into the deep end, you know, like if some band has like this classic triple album or something, not that there's a ton of those, but you know, people will say, oh, but don't start there. You know, it's so great, but don't start there. It's too much. Start with this easier one. I'm like, fuck no, I'm going for the big one. Like,
I understand that, but also like clearly, because I'm a similar way, but clearly we are people who enjoy like digging into music. You know, we're doing a giant podcast on Autechre. You know, I don't think that's how normal people think.
But some people do, because like seriously, XI was like a huge hit for some reason, and I think people were like, you know, it seems a little quaint now, 2 hours, but it's like people were bowled over by the size of this thing, and it was just like, I think a lot of new listeners were just impressed and like overwhelmed by it and love that feeling of being overwhelmed by it. So that's like the paradox here is I think if you're the kind of person that likes to jump into the deep end, Confield might be a good start. And yet there are even deeper ends now to dive into. So if you're that person, you should probably jump into like, just do NTS. Like, why not? But if you're not that kind of person, you want to probably start with like Try Repete or something. And I can't think of the person who should start with Confield in 2020.
Yeah, I guess that's a decent point. You know, I was sort of thinking like, you know, maybe somebody who was, you know, like we've talked about an old head, you know, Autechre fan, you know, someone who likes Amber, Try Repete, Inky Dive, and maybe they, you know, that they're curious about the later stuff, maybe even XI or something, but you know, and I feel like Confield might be a good entry point, you know, to that. but maybe I'm just offending I don't want to be mean to the listeners,
Yeah. All right. You want to read the next email?
Yeah, this is from listener Ellen. I have listened to your discussion on Confield and thought it's time to email you. It was an interesting podcast, but one thing I had to say is that the percussion on Sea Fern is not random. It has a repeated structure just over several bars. I perhaps should add that I got into Autechre via dance. I was a member of a modern dance troupe during the 90s, and we used Autechre tracks frequently. I am also a classically trained musician who also happens to love modern classical music as well, and jazz for that matter. Even today, Autechre is still often danceable. My daughter and I recently grooved to Equal 4, for example. Also, there's plenty of melody and harmonics within Confield. Again, the augmented scale on Sea Fern is wonderful, but as with Ligeti, Cage, Stockhausen, Feldman, Varese, among others, textures and timbre are equally as important. I also love bands such as Zoviet France and their use of found instruments a la Cage. Autechre are the same. It just sounds found digitally.
Yeah, I love that comment about found sounds digitally. I think that actually nails it. Like that's the relationship between some of these composers that she mentions. But my favorite part is her talking about dance, and actually she wrote a little bit about draft. So we'll get into that when we get to the draft 730 episode. But this is really interesting to me because I guess I didn't mean to imply that Sea Fern is random. It's just that like it sounds like, irregular in the way that like raindrops do or something like that. But there is, something to be found. And we talked about how it does make sense. And I was just really struck by this idea that if you like approached it as a dancer, you would probably get into these tracks in just an entirely different illuminating way. You know what I mean? You would like understand, because like their beats are weird sometimes, but there is a logic there. And maybe it's a good idea to try to like move your body a little bit to it, and you'll like find that inner pulse,
Yeah, I mean that's super like cool. I didn't realize that there were dance troops using Autechre music. That's like honestly really awesome. But yeah, I think you're right. A lot of people like think of Autechre as like just random noises or something, but I think that is like a misunderstanding. I think it's just like often very complex rhythms that people aren't used to like hearing, or it's just outside of like people's ability to work out. I mean, even outside of mine too. I know Sea Fern isn't random, but it's like I play drums. I'm not good enough to program or physically play anything like that complicated. You know what I mean?
It's funny though, because like there are times we talk about this like body mind separation, where a lot of times people talk about Autechre like this is music for your brain, not your body, and yet even when I'm listening to Confield or something, like there are lots of times where I just catch myself tapping my foot and I'm like, my brain does not actually know what the rhythm is here, but my foot does. You know what I mean? Like it's just doing it naturally. Like there's something in there that I've found, and it's just it's just funny how it is in there. It's just like I just feel like I'm kind of envious of Ellen, because I wish I was like a dancer, because then I would like really get Autechre. That's how I'm feeling.
That's a real Pilkington comment. My brain doesn't understand it, but my foot does.
It's true. All right, I want to read a truly epic email from Trond right now, who did some serious digging on the meanings behind the track titles on Confield. I'm going to hit you with all this at once and just see what you think. Okay. VI Scos Poise, which he suggests should be called like V Scos Poise. It's like a combination of viscous and poise. Okay. Sea Fern is actually the name of a specially derived cultivar of a tropical homosporous fern, which offers a dynamic new approach to teaching the basic aspects of plant biology, like some kind of synthetic fern for studying purposes. Pen expers, he says, I struggled a bit with this one, but found the word expers in Latin meaning without. Pen is in some cases short for penetration, so without penetration, which could be a reference to how some single-cell organisms reproduce. Sim Gishel, far-fetched again, but a sim is a simulation, and Gishel is most likely a variant of Giselle, Giselle, or Gisela, a name with origin from the Old German word Giselle, which means ray or the radiant. Parhelic triangle, a parhelic circle, is a halo, so something heavenly or something. Bine is a long, flexible stem of a climbing plant, especially the hop. Eidetic means relating to or denoting mental images having unusual vividness and detail as if actually visible. And casein is a family of related phosphoproteins. These proteins are commonly found in mammalian milk. A UV glass is a glass particularly transparent to ultraviolet rays. Lentic is organisms or habitats inhabiting or situated in still fresh water. Catachresis, the use of a word in an incorrect way. For example, the use of mitigate for militate. Tron concludes, I think I see some kind of pattern here. It's all about things growing and reproducing and life and light and ecology. The sound of a living organism indeed. So I think Confield is Autechre playing God with a generative oral ecosystem that they designed using platforms like Max MSP. They first surfaced on the Artificial Intelligence series, yet Confield seems to be an album about the inevitability of life given the right circumstances and about the inevitability of evolution of anything that can be classified as a life form. It's an entry in an artificial life series created by living, breathing intelligences, Sean and Rob. Or it could even be an oral take on the simulation hypothesis, the proposal that all of reality, including the Earth and the rest of the universe, could in fact be an artificial simulation, such as a computer simulation. Trond has put Gabe Overthinks It to shame here. I am just, yeah. I am so impressed. I am so fucking impressed. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm impressed. You guys should do your own podcast or something. Overthinkcast. Yeah, I mean, it's cool. I think they just kind of use random things as file names, and that's kind of what we get stuck with. But I mean, sure.
But there's a lot of like biology shit in there.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to say it makes sense, but it's not like he's pulling it out of absolutely nowhere. I mean, could be, I don't know. I don't know.
It's just interesting because we kept saying like there's something organic about this. It's not like we're the first people to say this, but it's just like the irregularity of it just feels like a living, breathing thing or something. And the fact that there's so many like biology, ecology related terms up in there, that blows my fucking mind, honest to God.
No, I mean, I'm having a little bit of fun here, but I do, like, you said we like hearing people's, crazy stories and things. Like, I really do enjoy it, it like really is fun. I mean, that's what is such a fun thing about Autechre is with these crazy, track titles and stuff. You can read things like this into it, and I do enjoy hearing them.
All right. You want to read a slightly less epic email from Jordan?
Yeah. Listener Jordan, he says, it's funny that you mentioned post-rock and Swans in the Tri Repete episode because I listened to Tri Repete one night and listened to Swans' Children of God album the next night and noticed that the endings on both albums are really similar. I could not hear the final track in Children of God without hearing radio. Tri Repete's closing track is basically an electronic version of Children of God.
Very curious to hear what you have to say about this as the Swans expert.
Yeah, I guess people that only listen to this podcast don't know, but I love Swans. They're one of my favorite bands. A huge fan. Waiting for the Children of God reissue to come in the mail any day now, even. I've never thought of that before. I don't know that I agree, but I guess you could see something in it.
I was struck, when we were talking about that Rizdio track, like it does have kind of like it's kind of like you could play that on guitar, like a kind of like slinking riff to it, even though it's on some kind of like empty tube type sound, but like it's just got this like snake-like, just minimalist, just this repetition that just keeps like pummeling and building an intensity. And it just really reminded me of Swans and just post-rock in general. And I think I just brought it up because I was saying like, I can really imagine how the rock kids, might have just started to get into electronic music via Tri Repete because it has that same kind of like just slow build and intensity. So
it does have that
Children of God, but I can hear it.
It does have that slow intensity. It's just, I don't know if Children of God is the one I would go to, but he's right. The closing track on that record, which is the title track, it does sort of have like that building. I think it is like a song that shows like sort of what Swans will become in the Reformation. This isn't a Swans podcast, so I won't go much longer, but I guess I can see it a little bit.
All right, well, I'll move on to listener Wendell, who wrote us to ask if we find the same tracks funny as he does, because they seem to have a sense of humor in places. Well, I asked him what he meant by that, and he said, I find Cowbrook on Chiastic Slide really amusing. I dig the track, and it just seems like they are having fun, maybe having a laugh. The other funny one that comes to mind is Sublimate from Untilted, 3:24 into the track where it starts to trip over itself. And coincidentally, listener Tron wrote, "But in my ears, that's not a rapper on CSEC, but a preacher they've chopped up in some kind of eschatological rant, paradoxically placed on the most calm and orderly track on the album. I guess AE do have a sense of humor after all." I'm very curious to hear, do you ever find Autechre tracks funny? Do you hear a sense of humor in any songs?
I would say no, except for maybe on NTS, like BQ or whatever.
Yeah,
that one's a little funny. But otherwise, I don't think I've ever really considered it funny at all.
Yeah.
No.
I mean, I mentioned like finding the hi-hat on Lentic Catacresis really funny just because.
Oh, yeah. It's just
keeping
still
the beat,
just trying its best.
Keeping it together. Yeah, I love that. I don't know if that was like the point of that, but I don't know. I guess like I don't really hear much of a sense of humor, but sometimes I feel more of like maniacal laughter. Like when I hear Gantz Graph, I feel like they're fucking shit up and maybe laughing like insane people while doing it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I mean, from interviews and like the AMA and stuff they've done, like, I mean, they definitely like seem like, kind of funny people. They don't seem like overly serious or anything. So, I mean, maybe there's something to it.
All right, what's next?
Listener Steve, and this is a different Steve. In your early episodes, I think you might have missed a little bit of the significance of the anti-EP. That one political act encouraged them to try some generative techniques. Now they have remarked that generative is a kind of stupid $10 word for a bunch of arpeggiators fucking with each other. But the concept and where they took it on anti seeded their later anti-template. No pulled punches, no holds barred. Everything is on the table when it comes to modulation. He goes on to say, I personally think their major contribution to music, and it is a massive one, all starts with the freedom that originates with the first substantial experiment to fuck with the beat, which is supposed to be the sacred signifier that tells one precisely what your reference point is in electronic dance music. I am a big fan of your notion that on Amber AE began their journey by focusing on time itself as something that is malleable. Modulate it, stretch it, change our relationship to it. Looking back was
yeah, that's
your part. That's your part.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, looking back, was the anti-EP and Flutter in particular like an even bigger turning point than we gave it credit for at the time?
After reading this, I think he's kind of right. I really didn't think of that at all. But yeah, anti like sort of is, and Flutter in particular is like sort of the first time that at least we know that they used a kind of generative techniques. I think we may have understated it.
Yeah, and it is interesting. I do think it's like it's a big deal actually that the beat becomes just like part of their toolkit, like something they're totally willing to destroy and just modulate and mess with, just like he says here. It's interesting because they start to play with like blurring the lines between melody and rhythm, for example. They start to like sometimes use just sound as a hook, and stuff like that. But it does seem to like, it takes a little while for them to really latch on to the idea of like the beat as something that is changeable and something that can be, messed with or used as texture for, like using the tempo as texture is like the weirdest, craziest idea. Do you see that as like, this is the big selling point of Autechre?
I don't know if it's like the selling point. I've always thought the selling point is sound design, but I guess that is like sort of part of the sound design because he's right. Most people, the tempo and the beat is like sort of that sacred backbone that has to is rigid or whatever. But yeah, they really do play with it and everything. I'm struggling to think of somebody that did it earlier or at least or better or anything.
Yeah, it's like what we were talking about with Ellen earlier. It's not like just random or like crazy. It makes a certain logical sense, but the fact that they just have the courage to pull the tempo into the toolkit of sound design, like you said, is really amazing. I think it's something it might just be like actually maybe mid-period Autechre's greatest contribution to music or something like that. But maybe that's something we'll continue to talk about as we move a little further into the discography. All right, last email. Let's return to the first Steve, who wrote us to recommend a 1994 live recording of Kalpal Introl. Steve called Cowpole his favorite track off Incunabula and was disappointed we didn't spend much time on it, but I get the feeling he likes this live version even more. He writes, "You had mentioned not being able to dance to Autechre. This is a danceable track. I've seen Autechre live 3 times, 2001, 2008, and 2015, and I think I've been largely disappointed with each show. It would have been incredible to see a set in 1994 when they actually played variations of their released songs." So we both listened to this live version of Cowpole Intro. What did you think?
It was cool, you know. I think he's got a decent point with the live thing. You know, it was a little odd, like hearing them play a song that you know, I recognize, even though it was, you know, stretched out and changed. You know, it wasn't just like they pressed play on the record or anything. So I you know, I really dug it. And it did seem like you know, very like, yeah, it's like they changed it to be much more danceable and stuff. You know, it definitely would have been like a fun thing to be at.
Yeah, I know. God, I cannot imagine being in this room, because it's like, it's mind blowing. Honestly, it's like, you know, the original is kind of like this gurgling ambient thing, and you know, it does sound like an intro in my opinion, even though it's very nice. But yeah, and it gets like a little pitter patter kind of a rhythm going on, but it just kind of like leads into Bike. But this one is like a 10-minute juggernaut. I mean, it's sort of like, it just gets going with a lot of like rhythmic play, and it's got that kind of like, you know, gusts of wind, sort of like whipping sounds that you hear on like Flutter, you know, like the drums on Flutter, like whoosh, 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 and it just like keeps building and building in intensity. And then when that like fat, you know, just square wave or whatever it is comes in from Cowpole, you know, that's probably like the moment that everybody in the club like realized what track it was, you know, and like probably lost their shit. It's like a soundboard thing, so you can't hear how the audience reacts. But you know, that just that fat synth, it is just like not nearly as powerful on the record, but in this live version it is like stunning. And then it keeps building with like angelic like choir type sounds, and it just, I don't know, if this was how the track was, it might honestly be like my favorite track on Incunabula.
I think it just really shows how good they are at like taking a song and making it for the room they're in, you know, like, you know, because if they played Cowpole the way it is on the record, you're right, you know, it's much more like ambient and I think like more understated and stuff. I don't think that would go over as well in a club, but they like change it. So in fact, like when you sent it to me to listen to, you know, I wasn't expecting much, honestly, you know, because I was thinking about, you know, the way it is on the record, and it really is like cool to see how they you know, change stuff. I think that is one thing we don't get with like current Autechre when they're playing like completely brand new material. You know, you're not hearing it for, you're not hearing something you recognize, you know, shifted for a room or an audience. You know, you're hearing it just for the first time. Yeah. Well, you know, that's all we've got. I guess I do want to say that, you know, on future listener email episodes, I think we probably will end up doing like some live, you know, bootlegs or something, like just notable bootlegs, but it'll be cool to get deeper into the live Autechre experience. Yeah, definitely. I mean, you know, I'm familiar with the officially released things,
and we'll cover all that for sure. But
yeah, exactly, and a couple other things. But I don't think I've ever listened to a show earlier than I think that maybe that Glasgow 2005 one that's kind of famous. I've never listened to anything earlier. If anybody wants to send them over, GONKCASTpod@gmail.com. Do the work for us. Well, if you've got any Autechre opinions, hot takes you want to share, bootlegs you want to send me, we want to hear them. GONKCASTpod@gmail.com. Next episode in less than a week, draft 7:30. Again, send us your thoughts, GONKCASTpod@gmail.com. If you like the show, help us out, subscribe, leave us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast. Look us up on YouTube, stay connected, Twitter, Instagram. That is at GONKCASTpod, and we'll see you next time.
See ya.